Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to this important event this evening. Today's conversation is part of our ongoing series, Holding Court Justice Conversations with AFJ. In this series, we feature leading activists, authors, scholars, and attorneys discussing current political and social justice issues. My name is Rachel Rossi. I am the president of the Alliance for Justice, and we are an association of nearly 140 member organizations committed to building power, transforming courts, and securing justice for all. Today's event, Holding Court, the Judicial Backstop During the Government Shutdown, is a reflection on the longest federal government shutdown in the history of the United States. Today, we're going to discuss how some federal courts played a role as a guardrail against the Trump administration's executive overreach during the shutdown. And we're also going to talk about the economic impact and the burden realized by millions of people during the last few weeks because of the shutdown. We are privileged to be joined by three outstanding speakers today who I am honored to introduce. First, we have Lisa Wayne, who is the Executive Director of the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers and the NACDL Foundation for Criminal Justice. Lisa has been an attorney in private practice in both state and federal courts around the country since 1985. Lisa was also a Colorado State Public Defender for 13 years, where she served as office head, training director, and senior trial attorney. Lisa is also a friend and someone that I have enjoyed collaborating with and have been inspired by over the years. Thanks so much for being here, Lisa. We are also joined today by Amelia O'Rourke-Owens, who is the founder and executive director of Resilience Solutions. Previously, Amelia served as a policy fellow at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau for 3 years. During that time, she also served as a CFPB Union steward. Amelia was also the protest defense coordinator at Emancipate NC. We are so grateful that you're able to join us today, Amelia. Last but not least, we are thrilled to be joined by Kristin Bateman, Senior Counsel at Democracy Forward. Kristin recently led the SNAP team in the litigation for Democracy Forward, along with a coalition of plaintiffs representing municipalities across the country, charitable and faith-based nonprofit organizations, and union organizations. Prior to her time at Democracy Forward, Kristin served as the Assistant General Counsel for Litigation at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, where she helped lead the team of lawyers responsible for the agency's defensive, appellate, and amicus litigation. We are so glad to have your expertise on the panel today, Kristin. For our audience, later in the discussion, there will be an opportunity for you to ask our panelists questions. Please submit your questions in the comment box on the platform where you are watching this afternoon. And please note that AFJ staff members will be monitoring the comments, and any comments that are not in line with our mission or are discriminatory may be deleted. Additionally, if you would like to have live captioning for this discussion, please tune in on the Alliance for Justice LinkedIn page, and we will drop a link to that stream in the chat now. All right, let's get started. And we all know the government shutdown, it ended last Wednesday. Let's just begin by zooming out and reflecting on the shutdown. One thing about it, it was different from previous shutdowns. It was the longest shutdown in the history of the United States. Any of our panelists jump in. Can you just talk in general, what felt different about this shutdown? What are the impacts of the shutdown that you feel didn't get enough coverage or people weren't talking about?
I can start on that one for us. I think one of the things that really jumped out to me about this shutdown was the exaggerated cruelty of it. What the kind of iconic example in my mind is that some grocery stores started offering discounts to EBT recipients in order to make, the last dollars on their EBT cards stretch further, or if they had to pay out of their own pocket to relieve some of that burden. And we can understand why the rule exists, but the USDA doesn't allow for differential price treatment of EBT recipients or payers. But when grocery stores started offering these clear efforts at relief for folks, the USDA sent out a bulletin to all, to all grocery stores, essentially, or recipients who are unable to accept EBT, and reminded them that it is illegal for them to offer different price points to EBT recipients. And that, to me, just felt like an egregious going above and beyond to really harm some of the most vulnerable among us.
I agree with Amelia. I think that we saw in this shutdown, because we have certainly experienced shutdowns in the court system, and it was that it really was hitting closer to home for so many people this time. So in the federal system, with the CJA panel lawyers in particular, who had not been paid since July the 3rd of this year, we saw people who were having to shut down their practices, people who were taking out loans with enormous amounts of interest to get by, people who were getting laid off or not accepting cases at all in the court system, which ultimately resulted in shutting down the courts and what was going on in the process. So it was really seeing it hit closer to home, I think, than we've ever seen before. And I'm assuming that impact had something to do with finally getting to a point where we were opened again.
Yeah, I think you really painted that picture very well. And I kind of want to dive in and talk a little bit more about those impacts. So you talked, Amelia, a little bit about the EBT and kind of how that impacted folks. A reminder for all that this was actually the first time in 60 years where there weren't SNAP food benefits available, leaving millions of people hungry in our country. We know that food banks across the country were scraped and unable to keep up with the high demands. Many states and cities really scrambled to shift funding due to the lapse of federal benefits. And the Trump administration claimed that it could not legally use money that Congress set aside as emergency funds. So kind of thinking about what the court's role has been, we saw that 2 federal judges rejected that argument and demanded to see a new plan from the administration. So maybe we'll start with you, Kristin. You actually led the litigation team for Democracy Forward in the lawsuit related to SNAP. Can you just share a little bit give us the background, what that litigation was about, and about the experience as a whole? Oh, you're on mute, Kristin.
Thank you. I'm using someone else's computer and I don't know how to use the mouse, apparently. Yes. So like you were saying, this was the first time in the history of SNAP that people were not getting their SNAP benefits. There have been shutdowns before. There has never been a lapse in SNAP funding. And that's because Congress planned for this, and Congress provided both a SNAP-specific contingency fund that has money to, break glass, use in case of emergency. The money is there if there's a lapse in appropriations or if there's some other problem. And also, Congress gave the U.S. Department of Agriculture what's called like an interchangeability authority, where within an office of the department, so for example, the division that does all the nutrition programs, they can sort of transfer money back and forth. And there's generally caps on the amount of money you can transfer back and forth, but in cases of emergency, the caps don't apply. So there were 2 buckets of money that were available to use for the SNAP benefits, both this contingency fund and sort of borrowing from other nutrition programs, one of which had over $20 billion available and only needs $3 billion a month to fund its normal operations. So there's plenty of money available, but obviously the administration was interested in using SNAP as a tool, a leverage in the negotiations on the shutdown fight. And so we saw that play out. And it started, when we in the states brought suit around the same time. And the first thing that came out of the White House was like, oh, we really want to pay SNAP benefits. We just don't think we can. But, if a court tells us we can, it would be my honor. That's a quote from the president. It would be my honor to pay SNAP benefits. The next hour or something, the courts move very quickly in these cases. And said you can pay SNAP benefits. There's these 2 buckets of money that are available. In fact, it's mandatory that you use that first bucket, the sort of SNAP specific contingency fund. And it's up to you whether you transfer this money from other nutrition programs to this. But if you decide not to, that has to be a decision that is not arbitrary and capricious. And you also have to bear in mind that you have an obligation to get SNAP benefits out on a timely basis. And by then it's like it's November 1st is a day away or something. And we've found out, and USDA has acknowledged that for some states, they are not nimble. They cannot get out. The contingency fund was only enough money to cover partial SNAP benefits. It could not give everyone full SNAP benefits. And so if they were going to only use the contingency fund, states would have to adjust their systems and databases and whatever to make partial payments instead of full payments. Sort of a complicated calculation of how to prorate people's benefit. And, some state systems are just older. They don't have the up-to-date computerized system. And so what that was going to mean in some states was literally people wouldn't get benefits at all for months if only partial payments came out. So first the court said, okay, you have to give out the money from the contingency fund. So that's at least partial benefits. You also have to give out money on a timely basis. And if you can't do that in a non-arbitrary and capricious way, then that means you have to go with full benefits. And so what the government first came back and did was they said, okay, well, we're gonna use this contingency fund that you court have said we have to use. That means we're paying partial benefits, but that means that for some states it's going to be months before people get anything. So then we immediately went back in and sought a further TRO and sought really to enforce the initial TRO to say, hey, wait, the condition there was you can do the partial benefits from the contingency fund if you can get them out quickly. You can't get them out quickly. Your reasons for doing it don't make sense. And so really what you need to do at this point is get full benefits out. Then it's all like moving its way through the appellate process, very, very rapidly. There's an administrative stay from the Supreme Court that sort of remained in place until the shutdown ended, and sort of mooted all of that out.
And can you tell us a little bit about the separation of powers concern that was sort of raised by the Supreme Court to temporarily block the lower court order?
Yeah, so the Solicitor General, in asking the Supreme Court to block the lower court order requiring these funds to go out, basically the Solicitor General was saying, hey, Congress controls the purse strings. We have the Appropriations Clause. The Appropriations Clause says you can't spend money unless Congress says you can. And really what's happening here is a federal court is telling the agency to spend money. The Supreme Court didn't weigh in on that. It didn't weigh in on the stay application on the merits at all. It just did an administrative stay, a brief administrative stay to allow it to consider the stay application. And so we don't have any tea leaves from the Supreme Court on that. But that was sort of the gist of the Solicitor General's argument. Of course, our response to that is there's no separation of powers problem here. Congress did appropriate this money and did make this money available for SNAP. Congress remains in control of those purse strings. And this is just a matter of the agency not exercising the authority that Congress gave it and not doing what Congress said, which was to get SNAP benefits out to people.
Well, thank you for that background, Kristin, and thank you for being in that fight, in that litigation. Turning to talk a little bit more about the overall economic impact, we actually saw the Congressional Budget Office estimate that the shutdown cost the economy billions in reduced GDP, and a portion of that economic activity permanently lost. Can you all just give your thoughts? I mean, you don't have to get into the, economic GDP if you don't have that expertise, but just to help us as the public kind of understand, quantify these costs, everything from missed paychecks, deferred investments, halted government services. Can you paint the picture for us how a lot of these costs are permanently unrecoverable?
I don't know who wants to do that. You got us all scared, Rachel. We're like, okay, is this macroeconomics or microeconomics we want to talk about? So, I will talk about it from the defender's point of view, and kind of the trickle down. Obviously, is that this continued shortage that's happening within the federal system amongst the defenders and the lawyers and staff and all of that it's not fixed. So the government's reopened. There is an anomaly, or which we call a supplement, to get the defenders at least through until January. But what we know is that the CJA panel attorneys to date across the country are owed roughly $70 million. And that's for work that was performed since July of 2025 and to the end of the fiscal year, which is October. The 2026 panel funding will again fall short, and they're projecting $124.7 million. And so what this really goes to, in terms of kind of an answer to your question about the economic impact and the collateral consequences here, is that the failure to fully and consistently fund the defender services will continually result in these shortfalls and continually impact the legal system and continually undermine the system. And so it is this just, this lack of vision of putting the money out there in the first place on the front end, instead of these shortcuts and continuous, things that keep going on, these shutting down, because it ends up costing citizens in this country, and that's the lawyers here. So if the lawyers are having to shut down their practice, I mean, a lot of defenders, and when I was a defender, and I'm not speaking for you, Rachel, but I lived paycheck to paycheck. I didn't have extra money. So to not get a paycheck, that was a big deal for me and my family. And you're seeing that not only within the federal defender system, but within the panel lawyers. And so those lawyers and the economic consequences to them, their communities, the fallout from that, having to take loans, laying off people, not being able to pay their mortgage, not being able to pay their student loans. All of that ultimately comes back to us, right? Someone's got to make that up. Someone's got to pay that up. And so the consequences to me, and just, what comes down the pipe, is just, it's a constant, and it's just nerve-wracking, I think, for everybody involved. I do want to give Kristin a shout out, though. Democracy Forward has been holding all of us up, boy, and really helping all the nonprofits. So that has nothing to do with this, I know, but I have to make sure everybody knows, because they have come to our aid in so many ways. And the litigation in the court, I mean, we call defenders first responders in the criminal legal system, right? We are the emergency room doctors. And when you're not funding us, then the cracks in the system will be great, and they will hit everybody. They will affect all of us.
So well said, Lisa. And I relate exactly to what you talked about and how difficult it already is for our defenders and panel attorneys. And so Amelia and Kristin want to talk about another piece of this impact faced by communities. People are already struggling to pay for groceries, rent, bills, more. And then in times like this, when folks are feeling the impact that Lisa sort of really accurately portrayed, people can get more desperate and turn to lenders that end up being more predatory, seeking other financially risky products, right? Like when you're paycheck to paycheck and you don't get that paycheck, it's dire circumstances. So we know the CFPB, where you both previously worked, is the main agency responsible for consumer protection. But we've also seen that the CFPB has been continually attacked and its funding threatened by this administration. So just given your background and expertise working with CFPB, can you talk about the economic issues and how they kind of lead to even more compounded issues because people rely on unreliable financial institutions? And can you talk a little bit about what CFPB has been enduring in this moment?
Yeah, this is my favorite topic in the world right now. And also least favorite. I mean, I think first as a blanket understanding, as people's economic stress goes up, as they have less money and are more worried about where that money is going to come from in the future, so does their debt. And so what that means is as they're maxing out their more affordable sources of credit or becoming farther behind on even those minimum payments, what we know is then they turn to more expensive sources of debt to either just get the debt collectors off of them for what's become kind of insurmountably overdue, or to try to fill the gap on whatever it is that they're maxing out. I do want to say that we saw a lot of financial institutions do some really interesting pro-social things, like offering 0% interest loans. Of course, there's not a very active CFPB around to make sure that what was advertised was what was being given, which is one of my first reactions always to hearing about that. But I think also on that's a good segue into what the CFPB has been enduring. And I do want to preface this by saying that I hope that everyone that's listening in their office or at home contextualizes this with the knowledge that Russell Vogt, the second week of February, illegally fired 200 CFPB employees. Like, no notice, it was like effective immediately. One of the batches to 170 employees went out via a mail merge, and it failed. So they literally got a termination notice that said brackets first name, brackets last name. And I think that the context that I want folks to keep in their mind is that what we now know from the litigation that's happening around stopping the unconstitutional shuttering of the CFPB is that had Vogt had his way, he would have laid off 90% of the remaining staff the very day that they got the TRO.
Mhm.
So the continued existence of the CFPB in and of itself is a victory. And it was one that it's fraught at this exact procedural moment, but it was won through the courts. And so with that, I do want to say the CFPB has closed down 40 enforcement actions since the last time that I checked. It's gone back into consent orders with illegal actors and forgiven their penalties that they were due under the orders. And it's not bringing a whole heck of a lot of new actions to fill that gap. So the consumer complaint database is still open because that is an open source database. I would remind all of the litigators and caseworkers on this call that you can still search that database yourself if there is something that might be relevant to you. But I do think that it's fair to say that the zealous protection of consumers that we've come to expect from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau does not appear by any measure to be happening.
Hmm.
And I can say that because I'm no longer a CFPB employee.
Wow.
Yeah, I have nothing to add to Amelia's very good observations.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Amelia. And it also, the way that you sort of describe this makes me think about how the intersection we saw with the kind of broad attacks on the federal workforce that we've seen already, and how the shutdown compounded an already very fraught situation. So just thinking for a moment about the federal workforce, can you all just talk about not only the financial, but the psychological strain, the morale, just what the shutdown added to when we're already seeing so much attrition, so much firing, so much just warfare in many ways against the federal workforce?
Well, I guess one other thing that I didn't highlight when you asked also what was different about this shutdown was that we've seen these kind of spurts of illegal federal firings, and the shutdown ushered in another little flurry of activity around that. and again, with the courts being a backstop, the OMB director, Russell Vogt, tried to lay off, I think, over 4,000 employees just after, I think, in like 5 days after the shutdown began. And I think one thing that I want to highlight to what you're asking about now, which is kind of, the emotional toll, many of those federal workers, because of the shutdown, were already furloughed. And so termination notices were going out to email inboxes that people were literally stopped from accessing and checking as federal employees. On top of that, some employees were called back out of their furlough despite not being classified as essential so that they could execute these RIF actions against other employees. So there's an element of absurdity and, again, exaggerated cruelty to it. But I do want to also honor the resilience that we've seen from so many federal workers. I think coming into this administration, a lot of the public chatter about federal employees was very negative. I think that there was a lot of misunderstandings about kind of overpaid, underworked, bureaucrats. And I think what we're seeing now are that scientists and public health workers and lawyers and advocates and economists care very deeply about the work that they do and the public good that it is, and that they are continuing to fight for their jobs, not just for the paycheck, but for the public service that they care so much about.
Yeah. I'll add in terms to the emotional toil that it's taken. So, and kind of a segue that from what Amelia just said, and that is, I think that for federal defenders, and there are two different things that went on with in the federal court system, and that is federal defenders stopped getting paid, and it was for a week and a half that they didn't actually receive a paycheck. But they, unlike a lot of federal workers, had to continue at work. So these are people who are lawyers who go into defense for the most part because they are committed to what the mission of the work stands for. They believe that everyone deserves a great advocate if you are accused of a crime in this country. And so you have committed people who don't get paid the same as if they were in the private sector, not even close to being paid the same, but they do it because they're very committed to the mission. And now they're not getting paid and they're told, but you still have to go to work. So you have to work for free. Now, the CJA panel lawyers are private lawyers out in the country who are also committed to the same mission. Many CJA lawyers, I was a CJA panel lawyer, they believe in taking those cases because, first of all, they're some of the most interesting cases in the federal system, and you are not limited to how you want to be an advocate on behalf of the accused. Unlike in a private case, I'm oftentimes have a limited amount of money to work with in terms of funding for that case. So it takes a lot of money to be an advocate in the federal system on behalf of someone. And so CJA work is such a great place to be for so many lawyers. And some lawyers choose to do it. All of their practice is CJA, and some of them, it's half of their practice or a quarter of their practice. So some of those people had an opportunity to say, I'm not going to take any more cases. I'm staying out of the CJA system. But other lawyers who depended on the CJA system were done. They had nowhere to go. And the toll on them, some of them are in trial. Okay. I know lawyers in this country who have been in trial for months, not being paid and told by the judges, you have no choice. You must continue. I know other lawyers who have attempted to continue the case, saying, Judge, in this interim period of 5-6 months where I can't pay my experts, I can't pay my investigator, I can't pay my staff, I can't keep the lights on, I'm asking that you continue the case because I can't effectively represent this person. Some of the judges are saying, too bad, figure it out. Some of the judges are in agreement that this is not their fault and the cases should be continued. But here's the tension for the lawyers. Then I have a client who's in custody, who's now I can't go forward on their case, but I also can't represent them, and I'm feeling guilty. And then now there's tension. Am I being the best advocate I can be for this client? Should I have done something differently? I mean, it's put such a strain on so many good people who are trying to do the right thing. And imagine how you feel as a lawyer. You're basically, the courts are saying to you, you really don't matter that much because you can just go ahead and work for free. We even had some federal judges in California, where everybody thinks, it's so liberal and great. We had some judges who were saying, oh, well, okay, I'll take the CJA lawyers out of this, and we'll make big law firms, we'll bring in lawyers from big law and make them take the cases. Even though they may not be litigators, they've never seen a criminal case, they have no idea what regulatory law is, but guess what? You can just do the cases, because after all, these are poor people. So imagine that kind of emotional toll that these lawyers are going through, making them feel like we're the second tier when we're not. We're the foundation of what goes on in the criminal legal system, and being told that over and over by withholding money. So it's been a big problem, and I think you're going to see a lot of lawyers who are seeing the writing on the wall and saying, why would I stay in this and do this for the next few years? And ultimately, that affects the type of representation people will get in this country. And this is not a political issue. I mean, I always am. Rachel's, she's nodding her head, but we both know there's so many people that we represent that may be in opposite of so many of our own personal views. But I always remind people who were representing the J6ers. That was federal defenders and CJA panel lawyers. Those were the people who were stepping up, who are representing people who nobody else wants to get near, who nobody else wants to have a voice for, and they're being told, do it. Do the most reprehensible kind of cases, the clients that nobody else wants to stand next to. And by the way, can you do it for free? So I just feel I feel horrible for my brothers and sisters, and as organizations, all of us are like, what can we do other than trying to get funding? We have sign-on letters. We're going to Congress. I will tell you, yesterday, all the federal defender offices, 82 in this country, federal defender and community offices, signed off on a letter that got sent yesterday about enough is enough. This has to stop. And that's pretty remarkable that every single defender signed off on that. I mean, it's hard to find unity in everything, and we found unity in this.
Right. Especially with the federal defender offices, I'm
That's
sure.
Right. That's right, Rachel.
And Lisa, you're talking about these lawyers who really make the Constitution, the promises of the Constitution real. Really would love to hear your view on kind of the imbalance when we look at federal funding when it comes to DOJ. So am I correct in saying DOJ remained funded throughout the shutdown, but
Yes.
many federal defenders and CJA private panel appointed lawyers, their funding ran out. So how does that kind of imbalance reflect the deeper imbalance in the system? And how does that reflect the guarantee of the constitutional right to a fair trial and access to counsel?
Well, I think let's start with the accused, the person that you're standing next to and you are their voice in court. What's the message to the client? That my lawyer somehow is different than everybody else, that I'm getting somebody that's different that doesn't get paid, and that's okay, but everybody else in this courtroom gets paid but my lawyer. I mean, that greater message to the poor, to the citizens of this country, that's a greater message to me, and what that really means. I don't think the judges are comfortable with this for the most part. I think the judges in this country, in the courtrooms across this country, know the value of the defenders in the CJA panel in their courtrooms and know what an integral part they play in everything that goes on in the courtroom. I don't think they feel comfortable at all. And thank goodness there were judges writing opinions. There was a case in the Eastern District in New York that got dismissed because of the lack of funding. that will probably be appealed, but at this point it did get dismissed. There was a case out of the out of the Eastern District of California, Sacramento, where the judge, he pushed back and said, these lawyers have a right to be funded. And the fact that DOJ had taken a position that Gideon does not stand for the right to free counsel during these kind of times was such the things that sometimes this administration just puts out there as if it's gospel. And this judge pushed back and said, excuse me, we are living in 2025. And let me tell you the cases in the history of Gideon and the significance of having the defense funded. So I don't think anybody's comfortable in it. I think a lot of lawyers feel good when the judges are speaking out on our behalf and saying we need them here and we need them funded. But a lot of people are feeling like their hands are tied. What do we do? So the judges are protected. The judges in this country remain paid even when there is a shutdown, because there is that Article 3 provision that allows them to be compensated even during these kind of times. DOJ as well, but the clerks, the support staff in the courtroom, they're not all funded either. So we had a federal defender who had sent, we gathered a lot of testimonials to send to Congress. And she talked about how she was a CJA lawyer. They have 4 children. She had 2 children with special needs, and her husband was a federal clerk, and none of them were being paid, and they couldn't pay for their children's, to care. And it broke your heart that they were even having to go through this. And I think a lot of us who become lawyers think to ourselves, when I become a lawyer, at least I know I'm going to make a decent living. I can provide for my family, right? I'm going to be one of those people that I hope AI won't take out my job and I'm going to be okay. I think that's true. But, there was some security, and you're seeing all these people without that security net. And it's a sad state of affairs that I think is not going to get better unless there is a huge recognition in this administration of what it means.
And Lisa, I want to turn in a minute back to Amelia's kind of point on the firing, reduction in force of federal employees. But before I do that, you mentioned some lawyers not being able to pay for expert witnesses. Can you talk a little bit more about that? How does it work for federal defenders or CJA attorneys when they need an expert witness or they're in trial, and when payments are stopped? How does the lack of funding impact and paralyze the ability to just keep going on the case?
Absolutely. So in this day and age, most criminal cases involve some kind of forensic evidence. There's some kind of geofence or surveillance or wiretap or identification or psychological issues. There's always forensic issues. That's just where we are in terms of, if you have a white collar case, there's going to be financial issues. And we hire experts to help us not only figure out what is the case about. Can you distill this to as easy as elements so that we can understand what are we defending on? Having to send out evidence, extraction, forensic evidence, all requires money. And so as a CJA lawyer, my money is hourly. I'm paid hourly. I then go out and look for experts who are also paid hourly. I have to get that advance. An expert says, I want to know the money's in the bank. I want to know that I'm going to get paid. There are lots of experts who are very committed to doing this kind of work, but they also need to be paid. My investigator. So the minute I get a case as a defense lawyer, I do what's called front-end investigation. I go out with my investigator and I'm interviewing witnesses. I'm reviewing discovery. I'm going to the scene. Whatever it might require, I have to pay that investigator. That investigator works hourly. They have a business and it requires a lot of work on their behalf. Extraction companies, forensics, DNA, all of those things require money. And when that was shut down, many of the experts were saying, I'm done. I've got to leave this case, or I can't give you an opinion. I know of lawyers who said they had a great opinion from an expert, but they needed it to be reduced to writing couldn't get it reduced to writing, couldn't get these opinions that were helpful to their clients. And so that's a real problem, and that's not the expert's fault. I mean, you want to be paid. Everybody wants to be paid and know that the work they're doing, the good work they're providing, that they're going to be compensated fairly.
It's so helpful to understand that broader impact. And I want to come back for a moment. Amelia, you talked about the reductions in force that have been happening. And as I think we all know at this point, RIFs, or reduction in force, are official notices of mass layoffs at federal agencies. And as you talked about, Amelia, this has been happening before the shutdown. And then in particular, there was attempts to do RIFs during the shutdown. And so for Amelia or others, generally, can you talk about how this kind of amplified the harm faced by federal workers? But then also in kind of looking at many lawsuits that came to challenge these RIFs, the courts intervened to protect the livelihoods of federal workers. So can you talk a little bit about what went down and why that was important?
Yeah. I mean, I think that a lot of what's happening kind of like within the government to federal workers, and I want to be clear that I have not lost sight this entire time that that is but one subset of the harms of what's coming out of this current administration. But focusing on that effect on federal employees, I keep on thinking of it. I keep seeing the image in my mind of this administration as the T-Rex in Jurassic Park, the movie, where they keep testing the fences to see if they're still electrified. And when they're not, they break out. And I think that like what we're seeing with the RIFs is a perfect analogy there, that we keep seeing this flurry of just trying to bamboozle an entire agency worth of employees with no regard for, with no regard for anything. It's not about reorganization. It's not about following the very clearly established statutes and regulations that govern reductions in force. If this government had wanted to reduce in force the entire federal civil service, it could have done it legally by now, about 3 times over. But they don't want to do things legally. And I think that that's kind of, again, why we're seeing the courts as such an important backstop, but also not the only solution. Because I really have seen, I mentioned earlier in the AFJ case, which is one of the federal employee unions that brought a lawsuit against the wave of RIFs that happened at the beginning of this shutdown. They got a temporary restraining order that stopped the RIFs. And then that case ultimately got a preliminary injunction, which is a kind of longer term court order that says you can't do something. I'm not sure if we have any non-lawyers on the call, so if we don't, I apologize. But I'm just used to translating these. But that the preliminary injunction said that these layoffs were almost certainly politically motivated, that the plaintiffs had a high likelihood of prevailing on those claims, and that these were arbitrary and therefore were illegal. So I think that what we are seeing is the courts are a backstop to allow on the ground organizing to happening to allow people, if nothing else, then to build an economically viable runway out of employment and into their next situation. The courts are, I think the word backstop is so useful because it's not a panacea. It's not probably going to save the day at the end of the day for us, but it does a lot of harm reduction right now. And we have to keep our for people who would like to maintain the rule of law and the constitutionality of the government of the United States, we also have to keep our foot to the gas on that. That just because we've gotten these temporary restraining orders and these preliminary injunctions that have been good and have been good rulings and protective and ultimately constitutional, it doesn't mean that, we can kind of like wipe our hands of it and call it a day. That these are definitely backstop measures that allow us to get other pieces in place to try to restore democracy.
That's such a great overview of sort of the impact of RIFs and how they've been happening. Sorry, Kristin, were you going to jump in?
Oh, keep going.
No, so I was in a moment going to turn to all of our panelists to sort of give us some closing remarks or ending thoughts on all of this. But before doing so, I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about lasting implications and looking ahead. So one question for our team is, does the wave of litigation that we saw and the judicial outcomes, which I know some are still sort of winding through appellate process, do you think that there's any helpful precedents that were established during this time to protect critical government functions? Or do you think actually the opposite, that dangerous precedents were set that invite the executive branch to use future shutdowns as a weapon for policy change and overreach? Wondering your thoughts when it comes to the litigation that ensued, but then also kind of the practices and also Congress and the role of Congress in sort of standing by and not really being engaged in the way that we would hope in order to end the shutdown in a much quicker way. So just curious to any thoughts that you have about, this was an unprecedented shutdown. What is the impact that will last beyond the shutdown?
I mean, I think what we saw, just to echo some things folks have been saying so far, is that for this administration, they are willing to be unnecessarily cruel. They're willing to play chicken. They're willing to hurt people to achieve whatever their ends are. And so I think that makes litigation an important tool in that context to sort of put a stop to whatever the measures are, whether it be cutting people off from food benefits or riffing huge chunks, additional chunks of the federal workforce, whatever it may be, to use litigation to sort of meet that unconstitutional, unlawful action and put a stop to it so that the administration cannot get away with inflicting that cruelty and doing what they're trying to do, which is to use those things as leverage in the shutdown fight. And so I think that's something we should keep in mind. And also, like you're saying, Congress plays an important role here, and it's really hard calculus to know when to cave and what to cave on and things like that. But us as advocates on the outside can keep the pressure on and can try to defang some of the leverage points that the administration is using.
Very, very well said. So we'll move quickly to closing thoughts, statements, remarks. For each of our panelists, please feel free to maybe give a thought of hope or future leaning thinking, or to kind of go into any areas that you wish that I would have asked you about. But Amelia, we will start with you. Any kind of closing remarks?
Yeah, I think I summed them up maybe with my last comment, but I would just add on to that that I think that litigation is one tool that has proven to be incredibly helpful right now in terms of holding people to account and also stopping the onslaught of what is really, for a lot of people, I think, a regime of terror. And I don't want to be hyperbolic, but I also don't want to pretend like during the shutdown, people weren't still being actively kidnapped by federal officers. And that, to me, maybe is another one of the pieces of exaggerated cruelty of this shutdown. But just to encourage folks to what I have been experiencing and what I experience and what I've been seeing is a total flood the zone approach to just kind of break people's resolve to fight for this democracy that we live in. And so what I would say to people at home and at work is don't give up. Just continue to fight every single fight. Get together with your colleagues, get together with your similarly situated firms or other agencies or organizations or nonprofits and delegate, allocate resources to make sure that you can cover the full surface of all of the bad things that are happening around you. And also that you're just trying to sit within what is known and familiar to you. And that both of those are okay. And those are time honored strategies in trying to keep bad things at bay. So be hopeful.
I love that. Very, very hopeful remarks. Thank you, Amelia and Lisa.
So I'm going to say, you asked what maybe Congress can do and what we can change up. And I guess it's what almost every American in this country probably is feeling. You just want to say, come on down. And when I say come on down, what I mean is, they're so disconnected to what the real world is like. And if every single person in Congress would come down to court for a day and watch the system in progress and see how the system works and what we're doing in this country and how the federal defenders have been the gold mark of defense and effective defense in this country, I just think it would make such a difference to actually know what is happening off of the Hill. And, I am just going to say that our public defense attorneys, they handle the most complex, high stake federal cases that go on in this country. And if we value them, we have to support them. And we have to support them with funding. And it means equal funding that is not disparate to the government, that it's equal, that it shows how much we care about preserving the integrity of the defense and an independent defense system, and and show it and mean it. So I'm hopeful that. Well, I'm not hopeful. I'm going to take that back. I'm not as hopeful. I feel like we have some real tough years ahead of us. And so it means that we have to have things like Alliance for Justice and you, Rachel, getting the word out, because I think there's a disconnect in this country. I think most Americans had no idea that lawyers in this country were working for free. I really don't. And it's not the headlines and it's not the sexy stuff you see on social media. We try to make it that way, and it's not on what is the app, TMC or whatever, the great app for all the celebrity stuff. If it was on that, maybe people would really care. So I'm hoping if we can make that connection more real. And I hate to say it, I think change happens when it affects me. When it affects my family, when I can see the real impact, then we care. I hope we don't have to get to that point with the system, but that may be where we are. So I'm not as hopeful, but I'm here to talk about it.
Yeah, I think it's really well said that this is a dark moment for our country. And thank you for that also kind of call to action, Lisa, for all of us to be thinking about how we can make people really understand what folks are facing on the ground in this country. Kristin, I'll turn it to you.
Yeah, so I think an important thing that I want sort of the world, the country to keep in mind is like we as people have agency and we can choose to resist and we can choose to stand up for what we know is right. And it is especially hard right now. There is obviously a huge culture of retaliation. And it takes a lot of courage to stand up and to, become a plaintiff in a lawsuit or to go to a protest or to film an ICE kidnapping or whatever it is. It takes courage to do it, but we need to be out there supporting the people who are willing to do that, because that is so critical. And it is so critical to preventing, just like the shift in mentality where things get normalized. That's something I worry about. And I think it's really important for us to keep pointing out the wrong things that are happening, pointing out that they are wrong, and preventing them from seeming like, oh, well, okay, that's fine. We can live with that. So.
I love that. And I think that's exactly right, Kristin, and helpful for you all to be joining and doing just that in this session today, to remind people that this is not normal and that the harms are real that the public continues to face. So thank you, Amelia. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Kristin, for joining me today. What I heard from you all was that the courts have demonstrated that they can be the final backstop to protect democracy and our rights, but they're one tool. We also have to be thinking about the power of the people, the power of coalition, but also it's fantastic that we have litigators, that we have folks who are in the courts fighting, and that we have had courts issue rulings to hold back unlawful executive action. We also have to continue to raise awareness about the role of the courts and about what people can do. And I think you all brought that up in different ways today, and I think that's exactly right. So thank you for doing that, bringing the education in this session this afternoon. Folks who are listening, please get engaged and learn more. Visit the websites of the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, Resilience Solutions, and Democracy Forward. You can get connected to their social media as well to track and understand what each of our fantastic speakers and their organizations are doing to fight for democracy in this moment. We also hope that you will follow Alliance for Justice on social media, connect with us, and stay up to date on future events like this. Thank you again to our distinguished speakers. We really appreciate you joining us this afternoon. And thank you to our audience for joining us and participating today. We look forward to your continued engagement in future discussions. Thanks again. Thanks for tuning in, and we can't wait to see you next time.